Excellencies, distinguished guests and friends. Hello everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to this international roundtable on the role of women in diplomacy, past, present and future, organized by Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global think tank working in the areas of international relations, area studies, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic and defense policy. I'm Tanisha Acharya from Tillotoma Foundation. We have an issue of great significance to discuss this evening. We are all striving towards gender justice, gender diversity, and most importantly, gender equality in every field of life. And it is very important in the field of diplomacy, foreign policy, and international relations. The perspective of women is crucial in both peace and war. Today, we will explore the role of women in diplomacy in the past, the present, and in the future. The distinguished speakers at this international roundtable on the role of women in diplomacy, past, present, and future, organized by Tillotoma Foundation are Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States of America and Germany, Mrs. Bahijatu Abubakar, head pollution control, Federal Ministry of Environment, Nigeria, and former global co-chair, Climate and Clean Air Coalition, Dr. Roxane Zigon, author and counselor on international relations and strategic planning, Russia, Ms. Khushi Singh Rathore, doctoral candidate and researcher on women and foreign policy. On behalf of the Vice President of Tillotoma Foundation, I thank you all for joining this discussion and being here among us. It is a great pleasure to have you among us. Thanks to all the audience members who have joined from across the world. Feel free to send in your questions and comments. If you're tweeting about this, our Twitter handle is TillotomaF. Hope you all enjoy the event. Let me now invite Dr. Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the United States of America and Germany, to deliver her address. Ma'am.
Thank you so much. I think it's great that the Tillotoma Foundation is focusing on the role of women and women in diplomacy in particular. This is an area where I think women have been a bit slow to join, and the world has also been a bit slow to accept them. But now you can see that the tide is turning. The first time I was posted in the United States was in the 90s, and I was heading the commercial wing. I was Minister of Commerce at that stage at the Indian Embassy. And every time I went to a business conference, the men would look at me in the room as though I was occupying space, which would rather have been filled up by a man in a gray suit. There were very few women, except, of course, as trade negotiators. The USTR's office, led by Carla Hills at the time, had quite a large number of trade negotiators who were women. But otherwise, in the senior echelons of foreign policy making, women were noticeable by their absence in the United States. Now, the second time I went to the United States was as ambassador, and by then you had already had Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State and as National Security Advisor, and Hillary Clinton was then the Secretary of State. Today you have a woman Vice President in the United States, but I think the US is still kind of inching its way towards acceptance of a female president. This, I think, was because diplomacy, as it was traditionally conducted, was basically by the elite, the nobility in Europe, or representatives to the court of the great Mughal kings in India. And much of it was, negotiating war and treaties and alliances, which men felt was their preserve. Today, of course, you have women challenging these traditional notions. You've had two national security advisors in the United States who've been women, Condoleezza Rice and Susan Rice. And this doesn't mean that anybody with the name of Rice has a lien on the National Security Advisor's office, but it just goes to show that women have arrived in the hard areas of diplomacy as well. Secondly, I think the whole concept of security and what pose global challenges today has undergone a sea change, from very hard security issues of military power, wars, annexations, treaties, alliances. You today have a much broader concept of security because the world is so interconnected that these challenges don't respect international borders. And as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, they can impact the entire world in the space of a very short time. Be it climate change, be it global pandemics, be it the question of economic development. These are now all, be it the question of human rights, these are all now issues on the global diplomatic agenda. And therefore, the traditional notion of security has changed. Um, I myself, when I entered the Foreign Service, being a career diplomat, and I joined in 1973, had to give an undertaking that if my personal life came in the way of my career, I would hereby undertake to resign. And this was at the time of joining. And it was conventional in most foreign services for women to step down when they got married. In fact, this was a rule of most foreign services, whether it was the US or UK. There was this sense that women would not be able to combine family and a diplomatic career, which means, somewhat of an itinerant lifestyle where you're moving from country to country. But we had a rather feisty lady who was our first woman professional diplomat, C.B. Mutamma, who challenged her non-promotion to the highest slot in court and cited the pervading gender bias in the Foreign Service. And the court, while it did not intervene in the case, because as it said, the government suddenly having discovered her merit, Mutamma's merit, after she filed the case, decided to promote her in any case. But they took the opportunity to talk about gender bias in the Foreign Service and also directed that this law should be struck down. And it was interesting that it turned out during the hearings that two prime ministers, our first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and our second prime minister, Indira Gandhi, had ruled on file that women should not have to resign if they got married in individual cases where women had approached them saying they were getting married and they were confident that they would be able to handle both the career and the marriage. But despite this, the ministry said that through oversight, they, had ignored the rulings of two prime ministers. Again, it kind of speaks of a traditional gender bias. Today, we have a much improved situation, though there is much more to be done. We have more women joining the service, and they happily combine both career and marriage, or just career as they choose fit. And when you see foreign services say that they have a problem because women have special personal requirements, I would say that this is equally true today of men, because one of the reasons why many men don't find the Foreign Service an attractive career in several of the developed countries which don't have an imperial past and therefore the sense of global power, is that their spouses are working and don't want to pull up and follow the husband wherever he goes on his career. So my argument always was that foreign services should be equally accommodating of both men and women. And the more they are able to accommodate people's personal choices or preferences, the better the work environment and the better the output that they are going to get. I personally have dealt with hardcore security issues, from counterterrorism to nuclear disarmament negotiations with Pakistan. Uh, the one treaty which I signed with, the agreement which I signed with Pakistan, was on pre-notification of ballistic missile flight tests, which means that each side gives warning when it is going to undertake a ballistic missile flight test. And this reduces the chances of inadvertent nuclear conflict, so that, you know, either side doesn't mistake a test for an actual firing. So it enhances the security of both sides. Now, women do have certain qualities which they bring to the table, which makes them good diplomats. And these are patience, an ability to hear and listen to the other person, and an ability to persevere and find the middle ground, you know, some kind of pragmatic way forward rather than getting stuck on a matter of principle. We've seen in the panchayats, the local bodies, where we have over 1 million women today, because of reservations in the bill, that they have taken a much greater interest in projects pertaining to drinking water, for instance, than all male panchayats, because getting water from a well or a tap is a woman's job. You know, they walk long distances in many villages to go and pump and collect that water. Therefore, they have looked at, you know, issues which are day-to-day problems in the lives of people and make the lives of people better. The same in Norway, where they found that local councils or municipal councils, which had women's representatives, looked much more at the issue of providing childcare, which is key to women actually not having to exercise the choice of either or, you know, either you work or you raise a family. And therefore, these are some of the qualities that they do bring to the table, which makes them good negotiators and good diplomats. They are critical, as I said, to meeting global challenges because they're 50% of the population, and also really key to the mental outlooks of future generations. For instance, if we still have, you know, very strong patriarchy in South Asia, despite, you know, efforts by governments, then you can't legislate your way out of it. You have to change mindsets. And changing mindsets of men, I think, becomes as important as changing mindsets of women today. Because we have in India a very forward-leaning constitution and legal framework, which are, you know, freedom fighters. When we got independence, our leaders were forward-looking enough to ensure complete gender equality, and articles in the constitution which said there will be no discrimination on grounds of caste, creed, or sex or gender. But the reality is that for women who can transcend their traditional barriers, there's no limit. But most women are not in a position to transcend their traditional roles, which seek to circumscribe them within the house. So changing the mindsets of society is very important. And here women would play a key role in how they bring up their children. Uh, uh, in terms of diplomacy and what we can do about it, I think we need to make sure that there are many more women present in every room where discussions are taking place on global challenges which are going to affect women equally as they affect men. Uh, it's important for women to shape the decisions which are going to shape the outcome of their lives and their possibilities. They can't just be receptacles of decisions made elsewhere. And they can bring a fresh perspective to the table, particularly in peace negotiations and conflict prevention, in post-conflict reconstruction and rebuilding and development. And they are key to many of our challenges. If you know, in India, we had this Chipko movement, which was a women's-led movement against the cutting of trees. And they were the ones who would go and collect firewood to use in their homes. And the cutting of trees was leaving the mountains bare, eroding the soil, giving rise to floods, and also ensuring that they never got enough of their local, timber, which they used to collect from the ground for their cooking. So they would hug the trees. Chipko means to stick. And they would hug the trees and prevent the forest contractors from cutting the trees. And that, I think, was almost the first grassroots movement for a green environment in India. Today, there are many more such groups. I'll leave it here. I think that we have a very long way to go, even as we can take some satisfaction that we have covered some ground in getting more women into diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Meera Shankar, for your inspiring words. You highlighted the scenario for women in diplomacy in the USA and India and the way it has evolved over the decades. Thank you so much for giving this international roundtable such a solid start. Our next speaker at this international roundtable on the role of women in diplomacy, past, present, and future, organized by Tillotoma Foundation, is Ms. Khushi Singh Rathore, doctoral candidate and researcher on women and foreign policy. I request her to specially lay out the academic framework on the subject, as well as talk a bit about the existing scholarship on this area, including her own work.
Thank you so much, Tanisha, and thank you to the organizers for calling me on this really esteemed panel. And it rarely happens that you are on the same panel as women you've looked up to and who you study. So I'm really overwhelmed because of that. What Ambassador Meera Shankar just said, as you were talking, ma'am, and I was going through the literature that I have read so far, the anecdotes that I have come across. So a little context. I'm a doctoral candidate at Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. My PhD, I'm doing it in international politics, where I'm studying Vijay Lakshmi Pandit as the first woman diplomat of India. And for me, when I embarked upon this study, for me, it was very natural because I thought, okay, first woman diplomat, ambassador to the Soviet Union, goes to the US, goes to the UK, heading Indian delegation to the UN, international figure, people look up to her, she has to be important. And then I look at history, and in diplomatic history, I don't find her beyond being Nehru's sister, who was the Prime Minister of India. And more often than not, I was asked, why her? Why is she so important? Why do you need to study her? And it would amuse me and also enrage me at the same time, because I had to consistently justify why this woman is so important, which to me was very natural. And that is when I started looking at women in diplomacy, women in in the history of Indian foreign policy making and implementation. Uh, from what I've been told, it's probably the first of its kind, the study that I am conducting at the moment. So Pandit became my entry point into diplomacy and the institution of Indian foreign policy making. I will not say IFS because she wasn't a career diplomat, she was a political appointee. But drawing from what Ambassador Shankar said, and I contest that a little bit in my work, where the usual perception is that, we've come ahead in time, there are more women in the service right now. So if you look at the Indian Foreign Service cadre at the moment, in 2020, there were 815 IFS officers, of which 176 were women and 19 heads of mission. For me, it's a step back, because when your first foreign service officer comes in 1949, when you've just gained independence, and it takes you half a century to appoint the first woman foreign secretary in 2001, this means you've really gone back in time. You haven't moved ahead in time. And that is something which I found very interesting, because even the case in 1973 that Ambassador Shankar pointed out at, which CV Muthamma, when CV Muthamma took her employer to the court, and the Supreme Court of India called out, quote unquote, the masculine hubris of the foreign policy institution, it took a rebel officer to do that, to go and contest the misogyny inherent within the institution that is the IFS. And academically, when we look at it, where I'm leaning, a lot of it comes from the colonial apparatus. This is, the imperial past of India. Because how else do you explain that point of transition where in 1947 you are sending your first woman, when Pandit went to the US, she was the first woman ambassador to the US from anywhere. And after Pandit, it was Ambassador Shankar who became the next woman ambassador to the US from India. So it was a long break over there. So how do you explain that, but not from the perspective of the various glass ceilings which exist within the foreign policy establishment? Scholars within IR, women in diplomacy, is still a relatively, I wouldn't say understudied, but it's a relatively new subdiscipline, because most diplomatic history is written by men, it's written about men. At least that's how I frame it. And also on the issues of the hard issues and the soft issues. And when I think of feminist foreign policy, because that is again something which I associate with women in diplomacy, because the change, wherever it has come from the feminist transformative principles, the principles of equality, the principles of justice. Because otherwise, when you just add women, or when you just say, well, let's bring a gender sensitive turn to it, you are doing a lip service. And, or as Dr. Shomita Basu says, there's a currency to the term gender internationally, if not in deed, at least in word. So you're bringing them in, but to what extent are you sharing that power? So for me, when and very recently I worked on a chapter on Indian women in the history of the UN. And an edited volume, we came out with an edited volume for Routledge, edited by Rebecca Adami and Dan Plesh, where we are looking at women in the UN history. And when I was trying to write my chapter, I was going through some newspaper reports from the first Indian delegation to the UN, and the world was looking at India and India's commitment to gender justice. The number of women who were on the Indian delegation, it wasn't just Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. You had Lakshmi Menon, you had Renuka Ray, you had Begum Sharifa Hamid Ali, you had Hansa Mehta. So while these women are celebrated, so Hansa Mehta is one of the most remembered because of her role in the formation of the Human Rights Declaration, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit because of her astounded victory again when she introduced the resolution against South Africa in the General Assembly and on and on. Sharifa Hamid Ali was someone I was really struggling to find any material on. And that again made me think about which women are we choosing to remember and which women are we choosing to forget. Because here you have, Pandit and Mehta, they all are elite women, but elite upper caste women. And then there's an equally elite but Muslim woman who is again erased from history. Doesn't mean she's not important enough. And then when I go and I look for a woman Indian permanent representative to the United Nations, I don't find any. So why I'm saying all of this is because I think when we are approaching women in diplomacy, what is important is to keep in mind that the glass ceiling is not singular. The glass ceiling changes. Every time you break one glass ceiling, there's a next one. What Cynthia Enloe would call the sustainability of patriarchy. And as you keep moving up, it becomes more and more subtle, because there's always a currency to being progressive. There's always a currency to adding more and more women in the discourse, but only to the extent that it does not disrupt the status quo. So if you're looking at the academic studies on women also, so Anne Towns and Birgitta Niklasen wrote this really amazing chapter in 2018, where they're looking at postings of women ambassadors, and all over the world, at least some it's just 15% of women ambassadors across the world. And they study the postings on 3 parameters. So they are studying it based on the economic status of the country where they are posted. They are looking at it in terms of the armed conflict, how whether it's a region of conflict or not. And they are looking at the military expenditure, the military might of the country. And when you look at the numbers, you realize that the more important the country is, the less likely it is that a woman is going to be posted to that country, which further corresponds to the the analysis that these very difficult postings are actually landmark postings, which lead to your advancement in the career. So systemically, even when a woman diplomat makes it, she breaks it into that really elite service, because it continues to be an elite aristocratic service. There is, there are several studies which several papers which have been written on it. And if you look at Helen McCarthy's work, where she's writing about women of the world, the female diplomat, you see the European aristocratic elite structure that diplomacy is in itself, which also explains why we think that it's something new that women are entering diplomacy, but you go back in time, you go back to that moment of decolonization and look at the number of women envoys who were there in the UN. You look at non-alignment movement and women's participation in non-alignment. So while we are talking about women in diplomacy, I think we also have to consistently be very careful that how Eurocentric our own explanations are becoming, how Eurocentric our own parameters of whether we moved ahead are in themselves. Because to me, India has moved back from what the promise was when C.V. Muttamma joined the service. And I will just, I won't take more time, and I would just end with, when Ambassador Shankar was talking about, you went to the US and how people would find it weird to have a woman diplomat. And I remember one of Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's account, that when she was she was sent to Soviet Union and she didn't know what was she supposed to do. And she went to G.S. Vajpayee and she asked him that, what is the policy? What am I supposed to do there? And then she's explaining her meeting with other diplomats, and it was a male-dominated world. It still is, with 15% of women diplomats, not too many women diplomats out there. And she mentions this one anecdote where she didn't know that after these dinners, at the embassy, the men would retire to to have their drinks and cigars, and the diplomatic wives would go somewhere else. And she mentions they didn't know what to do with me, whether I should go with the men or whether I should go with the wives. So they did not know where I was placed. And lastly, when I study women in diplomacy, so I'm studying them from two tangents. One is, of course, numerically in the institution of Indian Foreign Service, how women are operating and the culture of this institution and this service. But what I'm also looking at is the international thought of women diplomats. I think it's very important that we do not reduce women also to mere numbers and just look at the one or two women who have been exceptions. While they're very important, and that's where you look at their thought, you look at the overall structure of the institution, but you also look at what they are bringing to the table, and especially with post-colonial states like India. Because the women who were breaking these glass ceilings were bringing a lot to the table, including C.B. Muthamma and her feisty feminist thought with which she changed how women will be viewed in the Indian Foreign Service establishment. And I look forward to hearing more from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Khushi Singh Rathod, for your brilliant presentation. And your research on this subject is very well placed and much needed. Thank you. Now let me now unmute myself and invite Mrs. Bahijatu Abu Bakr. She is the head pollution control, Federal Ministry of Environment, Nigeria, and former global co-chair, Climate and Clean Air Coalition, to make her presentation at this international roundtable on the role of women in diplomacy, past, present, and future. Mrs. Bahijatu.
Thank you very much, distinguished ladies. For me, I'm going to take you in the direction of climate diplomacy because that's my turf. First and foremost, my name is Bahijatu Abu Bakr. My first discipline is mechanical engineering. And then as I grew older, I went into environmental engineering. I had more qualification in area of climate change and clean energy. And so for me, coming in here talking about diplomacy, I'm going to push you in the direction of climate change. We know for a fact the world has changed, and it has changed based on the fact that we embrace dirty technologies just to compromise the economy. In Nigeria, for example, we know that diplomacy is about politics because we're in a democratic dispensation. And women in Nigeria are not very active in the space of politics. We have 6.7% of women participating in politics, which is an all-time low based on global average of 22% of women participation in politics. And we all know that ambassadorial postings and political representation means that the woman must, or the candidates to represent the country in a certain position must represent in the political views of the government of the day. However, we also know that our women are very resourceful. Nigerian women, knowing that you're going into a male-dominated area, have to work doubly hard. Of course, like Indian women, we know patriarchal society and how women are looked down upon. And for a woman to be at the table, you must work doubly hard. And I always say to people, if they don't give you a seat at the table, build your own table. Don't wait for a man to hold the door for you. You can build your own door. Women are very resourceful because women are resilient. I'll give you a few pointers towards the need for women to be at the table. And that's why I say, if they don't give you a seat at the table, you build your own table. You look at what Ambassador Shankar said earlier about cutting the trees and all. Nigeria, for example, is experiencing a rapid encroachment of the desert at 0.5 kilometers per annum. And this contributed to the drying up of the Lake Chad. The Lake Chad is bordering Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. You can see the ripple effect on the economy, on livelihoods, on national and regional security. And who is at the brunt of this? Women and children. Women, no matter how many tree planting campaigns you have, they will go into the forest, they will chop the trees because they need to cook. Women walk far into the forests to get firewood on a daily basis. This is my area of passion because I work on the National Clean Cooking Scheme and I work on clean energy. So it is very, very important that a woman is at the table during negotiation. How can she do that? Number one, when you're talking about clean cooking, a male perspective is just about finances. What's the cost of the equipment, cooking equipment? What's the cost of the fuel? As a monthly or annual budget, either in a home or in a state or council budget or a school budget. However, for a woman, clean cooking is about health because you talk about indoor air pollution. You talk about the health of her child because she has to carry the child sometimes into the kitchen. Her little daughters assist her in the kitchen when she's cooking. So you need the woman at the table when negotiations are being made about the lives of over 50% of your population that are women. We look at the aspect of diplomacy, climate diplomacy, come to national and regional security. I've given you a little synopsis about the Lake Chad. The Lake Chad, the drying up of Lake Chad got a lot of people displaced out of their farmlands because the farmlands got dried up. The lake that charges the farmlands dried up. No fishery, no boating services, no farming. And so it displaced a lot of communities, causing clashes, intercommunal clashes, and whether it is accepted now or later in the future, it contributed immensely to people embracing radicalism and the birth of Boko Haram in Nigeria. So you look at when somebody has a problem, the first thing that comes to your mind is, oh my God, whatever you believe in, the higher being, you become more spiritual when you're in problems. And that was what happened in the northeast of Nigeria. When they lost their livelihoods, they lost their homes, they lost their farms, they had to embrace some kind of religious fanaticism. And that was the birth of the regional crisis we are all grappling with now. So it goes back to climate change. Then you ask yourself, what does it take the world to really understand that climate change is about economy, is about livelihood, is about health, and it is about global security? So the perspective of a woman at the table is totally different from the perspective of a man. And you see this G7, G20, which by the way, I think should be G21 in the future. And you hardly see women except for Germany and Angela Merkel. And then you look at the communiques that come out and you know it is just from a male perspective. It is important for us as women to find ways to come together through whichever roundtable, through whichever communications, through whichever conferences. We are doing well, but we need to do more. Sometimes you do not make your point clear by talking. What I can tell you from experience is that sometimes you need to do something to shame the men into action. Not because they want to do it, but because they can't defend not supporting you. So when the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, for example, was initiated in 2012, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came to sent a message to Nigeria and said, okay, they wanted Mrs. Abubakar to be the co-chair. You think you're doing something and nobody's watching you or nobody's noticing you, and all of a sudden, everybody wants to talk about climate change. So you need to be able to get yourself prepared. Yes, it's not just to fill the gap. We need to be prepared. We need to form a South-South, for example, what I'm trying to get across to you is a South-South collaboration or partnership of women in diplomacy or women in climate diplomacy, and exchange ideas. The Climate and Clean Air Coalition reduces short-lived climate pollutants. Initially, the UN Convention for Climate Change was not talking about short-lived climate pollutants, only talking about carbon dioxide. But the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, through this diplomacy, we started from 7 countries to 117 countries. We were able to get a lot of heads of government to look at short-lived climate pollutants because we were able to link climate change to health, livelihoods, and security. Now, the short-lived climate pollutants that we were campaigning about is now a part of the mainstream United Nations negotiation, and every country is now a signatory to it. Well, the US came out, but now is on its way back in. So I would like to enjoin colleagues to look at climate diplomacy and empower themselves in the languages that will make you relevant at the table. Our women are resilient, they are very intelligent, but unfortunately, when you get into the international diplomacy stage, you are relegated or looked at as if you're just given those positions as acts of charity. I'll give you an example of Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the new Director General of WTO. A newspaper in Switzerland actually just said, now we see the resumption of a grandmother. I mean, just rubbishing her years of leadership at the World Bank, relegating all her years of experience, sweeping it over with a brush as just a Black grandmother coming to lead the WHO. That is supposed to be, for me, I look at it as a compliment. I am proud of my heritage, but you can't beat me at what I do. We need to be able to come together as sisters, South-South. We've done it before. The United Nations Environment Program funded a trip of Nigerian rural women to India in Odisha, and we spent 10 days in tribal areas learning about climate smart technologies that can be replicated in Nigeria. We need to be able to do more in that part of diplomacy, climate diplomacy. We need to look at city to city collaboration. Like we know that Delhi has an air pollution issue. Nigeria has 3 cities, Onitsha, Kaduna, and Aba, on the first 10 most polluted cities, according to the World Health Organization Air Pollution Index. We can get the city of Kaduna and the city of Delhi to have a collaboration on lung function tests. We can have different collaborations on technology exchanges, and we will be able, as government to government, to come together, show the world what is possible. And maybe the developed countries will see that, wow, whether we like it or not, they are moving without us and they better join in. Finally, for me, I think it is very important that the young ladies coming behind us have opportunities of mentoring. We get to be able to have some roundtables or sit out with young ladies in the diplomatic circle. Above all, for me, I want to look into the future because the climate is gloomy. Climate change is bad news. However, there is a lot of opportunities, a lot of businesses, a lot of economical gains in clean energy, on climate smart agriculture. We need to be able to have climate smart diplomats. Diplomats that will be at the table and discuss economically about agriculture, but be able to transmit it to the rural farmer on climate smart technologies that would reduce methane, reduce black carbon, and make better yield for national economy to grow. So I look forward to hearing from other ladies, and I hope to the future that we'll have climate smart diplomats on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Bahijatu Abubakar, for your words on gender inclusion and climate change. Your words are inspiring and very important. Let me now invite Dr. Roxane Zigon, author and counselor on international relations and strategic planning, Russia, to make her presentation.
Good afternoon, my dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank all of you, Ambassador Meera Shankar, for the excellent speech about the role of women diplomats from the perspective of India. And I can honestly admit that I'm absolutely fascinated by the amount of Indian diplomats, Indian ambassadors, which are assigned all around the world these days. And from my point of view, having been located on the Geneva basis for the last 7 years, due to my academic work, in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations, I have been observing practically on a daily basis the performances of the remarkable Indian diplomats in the United Nations. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Mrs. Abubakar, for this excellent speech. I do support in every word. I cannot decide under every line that Mrs. Abubakar has highlighted here among us. And I can say that Africa is becoming one of the leading power centers in a diplomatic sense. And I can also register how African women are getting more proactive position in the diplomatic field on the global stage now. And the idea of getting united in the field of the climate change, climate diplomacy, I consider it as a very important thought. Also, I would like to thank the previous speaker, the researcher on the role of the women diplomats in history, and Mrs. Singh Rathod. Thank you very much for your brilliant, splendid research. I wish you all the best on the way of your academic activities. I do hope to see you in the future as the next Indian ambassador. No matter where it's going to happen, perhaps it can happen in Russia as well. From my point of view and from my side, I can say that I have been also doing quite an extensive research on the Indian women diplomats. I also have recently initiated a TV project, which is going to be dedicated to the influential women diplomats in the history of Russia and India. And I do believe that we can discuss it, all of us, and perhaps can lead this project on a more international level and to bring a whole international project, TV project, which will be covering documentaries dedicated to the historical figures in world diplomacy. Somehow we will cover up this gap And we will take interviews with the modern diplomats, and we will also highlight the current problems, and we will have opportunity to raise the awareness between the states about this issue. Because I fully agree with you. I'm personally myself as quite an international figure. I was born in Russia, but about 20 years of my life was spent in different parts of the world. I've been also working, studying, having internship, and worked for some time in the United Nations, in the US, then I've been accomplishing my academic postgraduate studies in Europe, in Ljubljana University, Faculty of International Affairs, and the last 7 years on Geneva basis. And I do believe that my experience and somehow my unique experience can also create a value-added assets for Russia as well, to expand opportunities for Russia, to upbring this issue, to expand the discussion about this issue on the global stage. Because unfortunately, Russia has a remarkable history in this aspect. As you may know, the first Russian diplomat was Alexandra Kollontai. I also am going to dedicate a special documentary film about her and her experience and motivation that she has given to all the women all around the world since the beginning of the 20th century, that we may all consider as a breakthrough in a sense of upbringing women, empowering women in a diplomatic field. But I would like to say a few words which will be embracing the reasons of such kind of gap, of disbalance between the female and male power in diplomacy, and how these kind of processes are affecting the modern state of things. The modern world is a highly turbulent place, and the world of diplomacy is one of the strongest mirrors that reflect all the diseases, weaknesses, fears, threats, and challenges today. The globalization has reached its peak in diminishing distance and time between continents, states, nations, and citizens. The technology has improved our lives, and the borders have almost vanished. But here is exactly where a new story starts. After a global COVID lockdown and social economic shock that the whole world experienced, we have become aware that something is totally wrong in its core, and none of us will be able to turn away from its consequences and emerging global transformation. The main problem of our modern world is not just an enormous consumerism and smart arrogance, as I name it, but a loss of the strategic roadmap, a decline of the ability to elaborate new philosophy of living, coexisting, collaborating. The global system is in a deep crisis, as well as the governance and leadership pillars. And the mirror of diplomacy reflects a whole palette of all those problems and pitfalls today. From my point of view, the reason of such a great decline and crisis of the global governance system is hiding within a serious disbalance between female and male power, dominance of the old patterns in the international system, which cannot match the demands of the 21st century, an era of the interplay between humans and artificial intelligence. I do strongly believe that the point is not just to promote the equality rights of the women in diplomacy, but to give to the women an opportunity to formulate a new concept of living, coexisting and collaborating in the modern world, to write a new narrative of the international system and governance, to design a new ethics and principles, to promote a new philosophy of interstate and intercivilizational dialogue, to highlight the idea of giving to the United Nations a chance for new transformation. I envision a necessity to move further from the concept of soft, hard, smart power towards a completely new vision, which I have defined as the enlightened activism. I have authored this idea several times ago when I started my doctoral research in Geneva School of Diplomacy. And somehow this kind of concept has started to develop furthermore. And now I'm just going to promote it on a new level. The crisis is not spreading as the scattered clouds around the world these days, but it covers all and at once. And there is only one shield that can protect us from the future threats and challenges, and that is in new enlightenment, which can be inspired only by women. I think that once the new philosophical movement will obtain its steady ground and start spreading around the world, we won't even need to discuss an issue of the women's struggles for their equality rights in the diplomacy, as there will be a philosophy which will position the female energy, mind, and spirit on the completely new level, and the female leadership will become a natural part of the global system transformation. I offer all of us, my dear colleagues, and all those colleagues which are joining us, and I hope will join us in the future, to unite our ideas, our visions, our forces, and to bring this discussion on the ground of the United Nations, to think about establishing a new international structure which will be formulating the principles, norms, and ethics of this new enlightenment and new philosophy. I would be happy if our today's discussion leads us to a much broader and closer dialogue and foster stronger international cooperation between our states. Therefore, I hope that those outlines of your ideas that have coined today during our dialogue will have a continuation, and we will be able to truly unite our forces and to discuss furthermore what can be done to unite our ideas, visions, and forces, and to create such kind of platform. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for your comments, your questions, and for the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Roxane Zigon, for your presentation. It was a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you to all the brilliant speakers for their excellent presentations. And it has been an amazing session so far. To the audience members, I would like to tell that feel free to send in your questions and comments for the panelists now. Let me now take short comments from Ambassador Shankar and Mr. Rathore on the discussion so far, and especially on the two final presentations by Mrs. Bahijatu and Dr. Zigon. Ambassador Shankar.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentations from each one of the panelists. And I think everybody was very involved, very passionate. I think Khushi had a slightly different perspective on where women are in diplomacy in India. And maybe I would like to remark on that. I think the early presence of women in Indian diplomacy, which she referred to, you know, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Lakshmi Menon, Hansa Mehta, and so on. I think a bit of this, quite a bit of this was paternalistic. It arose from their proximity to the Prime Minister. Whereas the institutional structures for supporting women in getting into the foreign service or playing a diplomatic role were completely loaded against them. To take Mutamma, for instance, when she did she was number one in the exam results. Then she was called, the written examination. Then she was called for an interview, as everybody has to go. And in the interview, they asked her, how will you combine a family life and your work? And Mutamma told them, it's none of your business. It's up to me how I do it. And they downmarked her in the interview, but she had done so well in the examination that they couldn't keep her out. Now, if you look at the assignments that women were given, you know, actually Mutamma in her petition to the court said that, you know, basically you know, there were two problems. One was those ambassadorial assignments who nobody wanted, and then women ambassadors. So the ministry decided to solve both by sending all the women ambassadors to the assignments which nobody else wanted. So actually, I was the very first woman ambassador to Germany. And I was the first woman professional ambassador to the United States. And you can see that this came after a gap of almost, 50 years or 60 years or something like that. And therefore, what I was trying to say was the institutional framework for women in the Foreign Service has become better because of the intervention by the court, and also by the fact that there being, initially, you see, there would be 1 or 2 women, apart from the political appointees, every year. Now there are very many more. And there is a kind of getting accustomed or becoming familiar with the fact that women are not, you don't have to tiptoe around them as though you're walking on glass, or you can't give them responsibility. You don't know what they'll do. Anything which is sensitive should be a man's preserve. That has changed. The fact that you had 2 women foreign secretaries, you never had that in the past. And Mutamma spent her entire life, in not very significant assignments, especially in later years. The fact that they actually did post me as ambassador to the United States. And after me, there have been women ambassadors, both in Germany and in the US. They've followed. So I think there is a growing acceptance of familiarity with the fact that women can handle responsibilities which are sensitive, and they can also be in conflict situations. For instance, Vijay Thakur Singh was somebody who volunteered to go to Afghanistan and served there in very difficult conflict situation. So I think the notion of what role women can have is finding more acceptance. But yes, it's still very much an old boys club. And it's something which women need to network to overcome, because we don't have this old school ties. We didn't go to the same school as the men. We can't slap them on the back and say, hey, bro, let's have a beer or whatever it is. So I think for women, it's important to network. And I like Madeleine Albright's remark that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other. I think, therefore, it's very important for women to help each other. And you'll see the same contradiction, if I may say, at the fact that South Asia has probably had one of the largest number of women prime ministers or women heads of government. We were the first, almost amongst the first democracies, not first otherwise, but with Sri Mavu Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, Indira Gandhi in India, then Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan, Khalida Zia in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. Now, all these women were related to political leaders. And I think it's because in India, or in South Asia as a whole, we have this tradition of goddess worship, where we worship women as being the primeval source of energy or Shakti. So you have this contradiction that once a woman transcends her role, traditional confines, the acceptance to some extent of her in a position in authority is maybe easier, was at least easier in the past, in the 60s and 70s, when the West was just not willing to look at women in a political role. But at the same time, the presence of these women in leadership didn't really change the substantial facts of women's lives, because they were operating in a man's environment. They played by male rules. It is only when you actually have is certain, what could I say, there's a tipping point that there are sufficient numbers of women present, not a single woman, not two women in a room of 50. When there are sufficient numbers present, that perhaps I think there could be greater efforts at changing paradigms. Otherwise, what tends to happen is that you operate within the paradigms established by the traditional hierarchies. So I hope that explains, the dichotomy that you had Vijayalakshmi Pandit, you had Hansa Mehta, but much of this really flowed from Nehru's own belief in the fact that women should be given roles. And yet, you see, Nehru was one of those who said, yes, the foreign service should be open to women. But then if you look at his remark, he says, well, there are not many who are likely to join. So the problem of accommodating them is not going to be that acute. So it was still a kind of paternalistic, patriarchal mindset. The realities of society and social acceptance continued. For instance, when I was a relatively young or a junior officer in the ministry, one of my bosses came and he said, Meera, you are working only for yourself. If you were not occupying this post, a man, it would provide employment to a poor man who could look after maybe a family of 6. So what do you say about vacating it? And so I turned to him and I said, well, you come from a very wealthy family. You could have afforded to bring up your own family without a job. So what do you think about leaving the job for a poorer man? After that, we never had this conversation again. Or, when Muthama's case came up in the Supreme Court, all of us who were in Delhi at that time, all the women got together and we gave a written petition to the Foreign Secretary supporting Muthama's petition and asking for change. So the then Foreign Secretary Jagat Mehta called us to his office to meet him. And we had sought a meeting to actually go and give him the petition. He was very nervous. And when he saw all these women, what did he have to say? I have never seen so much color in this room. So in some sense, I think from that point to the point where you could actually have a woman like me doing the nuclear disarmament negotiations with Pakistan, I think that's a huge shift which has occurred to some extent in the acceptance of women. But it's not like, the doors are open. You have to, they're always kind of half shut. So you have to push and push hard and push the doors open. And I think the more women who join, the more they push, the more then doors are going to open automatically. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shankar, for your comments. Let me now request Ms. Rathod.
Thank you, Tanisha. Thank you, Ambassador Shankar, and everyone else. I really, really enjoyed all presentations. And I would just like to respond to what Ambassador Shankar said, and 100%, ma'am. I think I wasn't clear there when I'm saying that we've moved back in history. I'm not dismissing the institutional framework of the IFS, and that is what, when in my study I point out the colonial legacy, or because the Foreign Service is an extremely colonial institution the way it came in, right? And with Nehru, absolutely, these women who joined, who were political appointees, they were all elite women who had access to the centers of power. Though in that space, when I'm arguing for it academically, it's also I have to be very careful to not allow that to become a dismissal of the work they did, because they were still navigating a man's world. So that is one area that, I carve out carefully. With regard to women, so when I say we moved back in time from that promise, I say it from the point that Canada had the first, Canada initiated women in the diplomatic service around the same year as India. And they have 30% women diplomats, nearly 30%. And we still are at 10. So my criticism of moving back in time is more a criticism of the will of the institution and the consistent replication of one glass ceiling after another. That even when Mutamma goes to court, you wait till 2001 for a Chokila Iyer to become a foreign secretary. That is not what the promise was, because because there's a promise to a newly independent state, an independent state which is post-colonial state, which is a product of that anti-imperial nationalist movement. You're building that country, and with all its flaws, and there again, what you mentioned about Nehru's comments, of course he was also of the opinion that women deserve soft postings, and what you said rightly so, and I quote that line in one of the short pieces that I have written, that though he was open to having women in the service, but his gaze was also fairly masculine, because it was a gaze of accommodation and not really a gaze of empowerment. So the push that I'm trying to make through my work is how I see history. I think history provides a blueprint for the, giving evidence that women have been here before and they have done remarkably. So the dismissal that there's no place for women on the table, or that women cannot handle certain negotiations, is misplaced. So the overall aim, and and that's what I often say, I think probably for the rest of my life I'm going to be studying women in diplomacy and dig out every story of every woman who's ever occupied those offices of power and negotiated. But it is through this history, because in that in the making, and the making of the UN becomes very important, because what you spoke about, and what even Mrs. Abu Bakr spoke about, women coming together, and you're looking at 1947, and all these countries are going to New York, and you see women coming together. They're talking to each other. There's a transition from the suffragette movement to the making of these independent states, and it is in that cusp that you find women's international thought, which the minute the colonial legacy, the foreign policy institution with its colonial legacy takes over, the women are subsided, and then you again start from the scratch. So my argument from going back in time is coming from that standpoint, and that is my feminist critique of the Indian foreign policy establishment, and also the way the history of foreign policy is written, where you very easily forget women, because it's easier to write, because when I think of Pandit also, if it was a man in her place, going to Soviet Union, going to US, going to the UK, going to the UN, there would be stories, sagas written about him. And same for Mutamma, the first ever woman foreign service officer in 1949. So that is where I'm coming in from. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Khushi Singh Rathore, for your comments. Let me now request Mrs. Bahijatu Abubakar to make her comments.
Okay, thank you. An accidental diplomat, a climate diplomat, and what I think the future requires of us is to have strengthened institutional framework that enables women to succeed. And if that, like I always say, if that doesn't work, we need to hold hands and make it work. Sometimes we've done certain things in the area of climate change and climate diplomacy that got the powers that be to come on board, not because they want to. If you have a big diplomatic meet with, say, 2,000 young women, vibrant, you have a meeting and you invite the prime minister, he will come for the photo opportunity, even if he doesn't believe in it. And while he's at the table, you can get one or two things on board. We will keep knocking at the door. We will keep pushing at the door until we get through. Apart from institutional strengthening, I would like to see us have integration of climate action into diplomacy, where we encourage our foreign institutions to have diplomats that would go out and talk about it. If, for example, you have members of the Indian embassy in Nigeria, there should at least, we can actually start something like that. Get the female diplomats in Nigeria once every 6 months, exchange ideas, tweak the brains of the experts amongst you, develop a climate resilient blueprint for your country. And I think when we meet on the global stage, we're prepared. For example, if we do it Nigeria to India, when we meet at the UN and Nigeria is raising finger to say, okay, this is what we do, India will support and say, this is what we gotta do. So I think incorporating and integrating climate action into diplomacy would assist us, not just now, but for the future. And I look forward to learning more about what we can do to make this move forward, because it's not just about the talk, we need to walk the walk. Thank you.
Mrs. Bahijatu Abubakar, for your comments. Your work on climate change is inspiring and so valuable. Let me now take comments from Dr. Roxane Zigon.
My dear colleagues, thank you very much again for the opportunity to give some comments in our discussion. I'm 100% can undersign under every word that I have heard from my colleagues now. I would also like to highlight the idea of incorporating the climate diplomacy into the canvas of the modern diplomatic life. I think it's crucially important. And Mrs. Abubakar, I'm a very practical person, you know. So I'm fond of theories, I'm very academic as well, but I really like to see things drifting into the practical matters. So I strongly believe that our discussion will be beginning with something pragmatic, practical. It's something that will be fruitful for all the parties. And in order to affect the mindset that Ambassador Shankar has wisely mentioned about, we need to start working it. And what can we do? Of course, only by uniting our hands, by uniting our forces, our opportunities, our visions, let's say by hugging the trees of each other and not letting to chop all our ideas and all our efforts out. Because I think we have been witnessing throughout history, I mean, a lot of times, a situation when the huge gap used to happen in a historical context, like my Indian colleague has mentioned about it. The same thing happened in Russia, and we can track this kind of situation almost in every state around the world, when episodically somewhere or sometime some kind of female figure used to appear on the diplomatic stage, has shined brightly as a star, has created some effects, achieved or broke a couple of doors and palaces and temples, and infiltrated inside of the male's world. But unfortunately, as soon as this figure has been removed or used to leave the position, all the effects have been diminishing. And the time has come that we should not allow these things repeat again. And what can we do again? It's a rhetorical question. Of course, we can start creating a kind of institution. And my concern is that this institution will not repeat itself, will not look like one extra institution, one extra effort, which will be just circling around theories, concepts, and shallow discussions. So that's why it's not for nothing that I have mentioned that we need to coin a new philosophy, not just strategy, not just concept of resolving this or another problem. Because on a daily basis, we're discussing all these issues on the stage of the United Nations. What we can do again, we can break up all these glass ceilings, which are multiplying itself, on a national stage, only by creating the international global structure that will become so powerful, so eminent, and so influential that it will not allow to repeat those processes on a national level, again. Because all of us individually, we are spending so much effort, so much energy by trying to break up, to position ourselves in our national context. And my own experience is absolutely fascinating. How much years it took for me to convince the males population here, the traditional perceptions, to deal with the mindset, to accept the vision that the world has tremendously changed. And today, the female who has an extensive international experience is not a threat to the national state, but it's an asset. It's a treasure which has to be praised and has to be promoted instead of oppressed or blocked or limited on every step. And it takes, of course, a great resilience and a sense of humor, perhaps, and an incredibly strong character to be capable to go on and to continue activities. Some years ago, I used to establish a strategic consultancy company in Slovenia. That was my first company and a first example of the business entity that has been aiming at combining the diplomatic field, business, culture, and science all together. Let's say more than 10 years ago, I had tried like a prototype of the future global structure. That's why I'm not just saying something without any experience which is standing behind it. And again, I would like us to come together, perhaps to continue our dialogue, rewrite the things, perhaps publish a paper of what we have discussed today, and then to take it from there, to move on and to think what kind of steps we can do, not just academically, not only in the theoretical aspect, but also in the practical realm. And I think that's the only way how we can break up that glass ceiling, which is falling off on all our steps and all our pathways. I do hope that there are a lot of our colleagues and friends who are participating in this conference. I assume that there are some of my colleagues from the United States as well. I'm sending my warmest greetings to them. I know that they're my co-thinkers. We have been communicating and discussing those aspects for years. And I do hope that the question of female encouragement will truly cross the national borders and will finally land on a steady ground. Because the issue of climate change, it's not anymore the prerogative, of the Davos Forum. I know all those discussions every year, and I know the results of these discussions. They publish splendid reports, but I think that it's really not enough. The world has truly changed, and only females, only women in diplomacy, by articulating the new principles of this diplomatic approach on a global stage, can give a new boost, can give a new inspiration and motivation in a practical sense. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to co-work with you in the future, with all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Zigon. Thank you to all the wonderful speakers. We have one question to Mrs. Bahijatu. How do you see women as stakeholders when it comes to the issues related to climate change? And also, what is your perspective for women of the third world countries, especially in particular, because there the women are most vulnerable to the threats that occur from climate change? Ma'am.
Thank you very much. women in the space of climate change are stakeholders, and we believe that in Africa, especially in my country, we believe that women are the majority stakeholders. We see crises in Africa about land degradation, water depletion, and different kinds of resources being depleted. However, we see great opportunities. Part of our national contributions and commitments to the issues of climate change, even before COP 15, was the fact that Nigeria, as a developing country, does not wait for developed countries to assist us in issues of climate change. We are looking for partners and not handouts. We believe that because of our population in Africa, the challenges the climate change provides in Nigeria becomes a great opportunity for us. Giving you an example of clean cooking technologies, over 97% of Nigerian women die annually from the effect of air pollution due to the fact that they use firewood for cooking, due to indoor air pollution. Instead of going on and talking about the crisis it is creating of tree felling and woodlot depletion, we have to look at the business opportunity it creates for the women. Women are being taught how to assemble cook stoves and solar lanterns in their villages. And that was one of the reasons we went to Odisha for 10 days for the country-to-country learning experience. Now women are selling cook stoves. Women are selling solar lanterns. So out of climate crisis, we have business opportunities. Nationally, we have the Renewable Energy Program, and my office and the office of the former Minister Farouk Abdullah, we had a collaboration on new and renewable energy, and we have big businesses coming into Nigeria to invest. So it is very important when you go into negotiation to have women at the table. And we make sure in Nigeria that when these discussions are being made, we are represented at the table. Because a cook stove that works in India does not work in Nigeria because of our cuisines, our diets are totally different. And so in as much as we have issues in agriculture, we also have the opportunity of engaging, creating more employment by reducing the emissions from agriculture and ensuring that women participate more in, for example, harvesting methane from a rice paddy or wheat farm for biogas or electricity, from a waste dump or from different animal dung. So for us, yes, it is a big crisis, but I always say, don't look at your cup half empty, look at it as half full. And I always tell the women that when you go to the table, yes, men are usually scared of enlightened and strong women, but sometimes you go onto the table not looking like a hormone-raging vampire that wants to devour them because they're already scared. So what we need to do is go prepared, but also sometimes just massage their egos and give them something to bring to the table. Because we know as women what we want. We know how this climate change affects women in Africa. We know women have to walk farther and farther to get water. We know women have to walk farther and farther to get firewood. And in the process, they are raped on the road. Every single day she goes to get water, she's raped. And she comes back home, she can't discuss this with her mother because it's a taboo to talk about rape in our society. And it goes on and on and on and on. And so it affects women, but we also know that there's bigger business opportunities. And that's what we try to harness for our women in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Bahijatu, for the fantastic reply. We have another question. Diplomacy has the potential to contain and diminish the move towards war using military power. Yet the strategy is hard to design. Women may be well equipped to design and implement a grand strategy of diplomacy. What do the panelists think about it? So we can have Ambassador Meera Shankar first, maybe.
Must be diplomacy. It cannot be resort to military power in the first instance, which has been a tendency in recent years. So I think we really need to shore up the capabilities to engage in diplomacy as a way of preventing war, as a way of conflict prevention, as a way of conflict resolution, and as a way of post-conflict building. I think diplomacy has to be in the lead. And it is where diplomacy fails that you have conflicts which arise. And to the extent that we can create international networks which keep lines of communication open, which try to build more connectivity and interconnections, I think to that extent, it will be a better world.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Meera Shankar. Next, Ms. Khushi, how do you look at the contemporary role of women in Indian foreign policy?
As I have said before, I do think that, and the women who have broken the barriers, who have, and as Ambassador Shankar also said, there are women foreign secretaries being appointed, there are women being appointed to big powers right now, but I still think there is, and echoing what Ambassador Shankar said, that there is a long, long way to go. The recruitment is still less. The number of women heading missions is still fairly low. So I often draw from Cynthia Enlow's semi-annual question, which she asked 3 decades ago of international relations, where are the women? I always ask, where are the women in Indian diplomacy? And when you ask that question, trust me, more often than not, it's you get a very uncomfortable silence in response. So there are more and more women joining the service, but there is a lot more for the institution of Indian Foreign Service to ensure that they rise up to the highest ranks. And I think that why that also becomes crucial is because of another area that I work on is the feminist foreign policy, the feminist foreign policy push for India, for South Asia as a region as well. And I think there's a lot more that needs to be explored over there, especially in light of the political climate that we are living in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the speakers who made this international roundtable on the role of women and diplomacy, past, present, and future, a success. I thank all the esteemed speakers for their excellent presentations and comments at this international roundtable organized by Tillotoma Foundation. Thank you so much for joining.